Hello, everybody. My name is Brittany Dawn Cook. I'm the Executive Director of the California State Library Foundation, and this is Dear California, a virtual series put on by the California State Library Foundation. And today we're joined by two wonderful authors. We have our moderator, Helen Zia. Her latest book, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, is available. I suggest you get your hands on a copy, as well as our speaker, Julia Seiler, and her new book, The White Devil's Daughters, who is also featured in Bulletin 128 with her lovely article that we will be discussing tonight. So I want to thank all of you for joining us and remind you that the only reason we'll be able to put on these events is through our lovely membership. So if you like tonight's event, please consider donating to the California State Library Foundation and becoming a member so you can get our lovely publications, the Bulletin. Without further ado, I'm going to remind everybody once more to please turn your microphones and your webcams off, but I'm going to pass the microphone over to Helen. Thank you both for joining us.
Sure. Thank you, Brittany Dawn and the California State Library Foundation for hosting this amazing writer and her incredible book and the essay she wrote, regarding The White Devil's Daughter. And I'm just honored to be here to ask questions and to get Julia Seiler to talk to you about all of this. So as Brittany Dawn said, Julia, has written really a wonderful essay just about part of the work she did to get the material for this really important book about events that happened more than 100 years ago. And so I thought I would just start out, Julia, if you could tell us about this essay you wrote that was about a photo that you received from the California State Archives, and you were already 4 years into your research, which I have to say, as an author, just sort of, it's like, oh my God, getting some information, number one, that's great, but also the fact that you were already well into the formulation of your book. And so from your essay in the Bulletin, you say how significant these photos were. So if you could talk about that, please.
Of course. And first of all, thank you so much, Helen. I so appreciate you being here today. I think you're number one fan, and I just have to do a shout out. I loved her book so much, Last Boat Out of Shanghai. She is an amazing writer, researcher, activist, and it's an incredible honor to be here with you, Helen. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this essay was really about a moment of surprise and serendipity. As you said, 4 years into my research, I got a very surprising and wonderful email from the California State Library. It was from one of the librarians saying, "Oh, I helped you a while back with some photographs, but I just came across a few others that you might be interested in." And of course I said, "Yes, please, I'd love to see them." And it turned out, Brittany Dawn, is it possible for you to show us the photograph we're talking about, the Stellman photograph from the State Archives? Thank you so much. So this was one of a series of 3 photographs taken by a very well-known journalist and photographer. Nope, it's the last one you had up. Yep, you got it. A well-known journalist and photographer named Louis J. Stellman. He worked out of San Francisco and really around the state. And besides being an absolutely gorgeous portrait of the 6 women, this is a very important photograph, or at least I saw it that way. And let me set the stage first. It was taken at the mission house, the Presbyterian mission house, right around the turn of the 20th century. And it was almost certainly taken in the formal reception room. You can see the wood paneling behind the women. And there was very little information around this photograph, except identification of the woman in the center. And that woman's name was Donaldina Cameron. And she's the woman, she's the long-serving superintendent of this home that it's now named for. It's now known as Cameron House. It's still standing today. But what was so wonderful and surprising about this photograph was that it showed the Asian women who were the staffers, who helped work side by side, sometimes running the home themselves. That was at the center of a really inspiring mission that operated for 7 decades, from the 1870s to the 1930s. And so my first reaction, Helen, was, oh, I've got another photograph of Tien Fu Wu, and that's the woman who's standing next to Donaldina Cameron. She's staring straight at the camera, and she is wearing the white formal gown. And she's not wearing glasses, she normally did, but I was thrilled to have a photograph of Tien Fu Wu, because my book in some ways is a book about the partnership and friendship between these 2 women and what they did for so many years together in terms of fighting for social justice and helping protect vulnerable women.
And in fact, this photo is taken from the title of your book, The White Devil and Some of Her Daughters, right?
Yes, it is.
Could you just say a little bit about that? Why just even the name White Devil, where does that come from?
Sure. So Donaldina Cameron, again, the woman in the middle with the old-fashioned Gibson girl bun, very Victorian type of bun, actually early 20th century type of hairstyle. She was very effective working with her colleagues like Tien and like the other women in disrupting the business of human trafficking. So effective that the traffickers and other enemies came to call her the White Devil. Meanwhile, the girls and women who worked at the home, they often referred to her as Mother or Lomo. And that's where the title comes from. The White Devil, of course, was Donaldina Cameron, or that's how she was known. And the daughters were some of the women surrounding her. And they, in fact, did refer to her as Mother in correspondence and other ways. So.
Do you want to say a little bit about how you came to this topic? And so when this photo was, sent to you, you've mentioned that it sort of changed your perspective on, a bit on how you were approaching the book or the story that you thought you were going to be telling. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Oh, of course, of course. When I first got interested in this subject, it was because I'd read Donaldina Cameron's first-person account of what had happened in 1906, the morning of the earthquake. And at the time, there were approximately 50, maybe a few more, girls and women who were living in this home, this safe house on Sacramento Street. And she wrote a very vivid description of what it was like to take this big group of people and get them safely across the bay. And that made me want to learn more about the home and also about some of the girls and women who were living at the home and who passed through its door. But many of the biographies and articles in subsequent years always focused on Donaldina Cameron and seemed to ignore the other women around her who really did arguably the bulk of the work in making this safe house work. It was almost as if the other women, the women we just saw in that photograph, had been erased in favor of a narrative that just focused on this white woman. And so this photograph was so important to me because it gave equal prominence to the 4 Asian women who were also part of this very important kind of pioneering institution. And we didn't really know very much about them. And so part of what I tried to do in my book, and what I'm absolutely sure that other researchers and other writers will do going forward, is to fill out those lives, those erased lives. Or I shouldn't say erased, let's bring them back and try to tell their stories as well. And so to find, I had been working in that direction with my research at the National Archives at Stanford, at UC Berkeley. But to find such a vivid photograph that showed the staffers and showed the way that it was, both white women and Chinese women working together in this mission, that was really helpful. And it was visually also quite an interesting photograph, because there was not, while Donaldina Cameron is centered in it, the visual weight of the photograph in some ways focuses on the women around her. And part of that, I think, is because the Asian women in particular are looking directly at the photographer, directly at the camera, whereas Donaldina Cameron's got is glancing off to the side. So it says a lot. There's a lot packed into that photograph.
Yeah. And at this point, 100 some years later, we can only project what was going on, and that's where your book is so critical and so detailed. I want to get to the part about you're then, having these women to find more information, because as you said, a lot of that was missing from the, narrative that had emerged. But your book, I want to actually, if you could say more about the whole context of what you were writing about in your book. You talk about that period of time. You talk about the sex trafficking trade, and in great detail, and the laws that existed back then, that the anti-Chinese laws, the ones that the Page Act that actually came before the Chinese Exclusion Act that excluded all Chinese women, with certain limitations, and then that was followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act. So this is a very anti-Chinese period of time in American history, and in some ways was centered in San Francisco, where a lot of that sort of hate and stuff was generated from. Yet at the same time, you uncovered and wrote about this really extensive sex trafficking trade that, had officials, City Hall, the San Francisco police, and people who were part of that. And so, so these women, Donaldina Cameron and, her daughters, were all part of trying to disrupt that. But so could you talk a bit about, knowing that even today, the sex trafficking trade, I mean, this is pretty big money. These are very, very powerful and well-to-do figures today, as well as then, that are profiting off of this human trafficking. And yet these women, were so courageous enough to try to undermine it and change it. So could you tell us a little bit about what it was like then, in terms of from, City Hall to the alleys of Chinatown?
Absolutely. So there's a long history, Helen, as you noted, of anti-Asian violence, and absolutely it was centered in San Francisco and radiating out from there in the mid-19th century. So setting the scene, the gold rush took place 1848, 1849. By the 1850s, and it started to taper off. And many of the Chinese men who'd left their families back in China to come to work the mines and build railways, they were out of work. So they came to the big city, they came to San Francisco. And San Francisco became a very male-oriented place. And it was male-oriented not only from Chinese men who had gone there, but white men as well. There were many more men in San Francisco during that period of time than women. And thus there was a huge demand for sex. and a number of brothels sprung up in response to that demand, both in the Barbary Coast and the neighboring neighborhood of Chinatown, of course, centered around Portsmouth Square, about 12 square blocks, incredibly tight and very crowded area. And so there was this huge demand for sex, and there was extremely, as you pointed out, extremely lucrative business to be done in bringing women to satisfy that demand. So there was a vibrant trafficking business, so much so that in the 1870s, there were late 1860s, 1870s, there were accounts in the newspapers of auctions of women on the streets of San Francisco. Asian women, so they would come off the boats, and in some cases they would be loaded onto carts, brought up to Chinatown, and of course they're accompanied by San Francisco officials. So there were a lot of people who were profiting from this business, officials, immigration officials, police officers who were taking bribes. Against this backdrop, of course, there's also a great deal of anti-Asian violence taking place. I mean, probably most famously, right around that same time, was the lynching of 21 Chinese men in Los Angeles. That was in 1871, but of course there's violence across the West, and historians are starting to document that more fully now. And there was a lot of violence towards women because there was the preconception that every Asian woman coming to the United States was a prostitute, and that was the origin of the Page Act of 1872, the notion that by barring them from coming, that would somehow address what was going on. But as now, much of the violence was also directed at Asian women. And, for me, and I know for you and your spectacular work, Helen, it's reconstructing the stories of women who'd been trafficked, of women who were very vulnerable and often didn't enter the country legally or came under false names. It was a real challenge, but their stories are so important to tell. And the reason that I was so astounded to see that photograph, thanks to the California State Library, was because one of the women who left behind the most vibrant record of her life was Tien Fu Wu, who was Donald Lena Cameron's deputy. And she had been sold by her father. And so we have not only her oral history, for example. She was interviewed by him, Mark Lai, in a tape in the 1970s, shortly before she died, which is at Berkeley. It was amazing to hear her voice, but we heard her own telling of her experience as a trafficked woman. And that was astonishing to me, and especially astonishing to have that life experience of being vulnerable and then to go fight on the behalf of other girls and women who are vulnerable as well, and devote your life to it.
Right. Well, it must have been, they must have been so brave. I mean, this little band of women, the White Devil and her daughters, and, as she was known then. And you just, how did this little team manage to go against these, powerful figures, sort of equivalent of the mob then, whether it was in Chinatown, but also then extending into City Hall. And they had some very brave, encounters too, right? I think you have some photos of some of that, of the rescues that they did.
Mm-hmm. Brittany, Dawn, do you have the rescue photo we can share? So this is a photograph that was almost certainly staged by a newspaper reporter right around the turn of the 20th century. And it was probably shot to accompany a newspaper article about the work that this very small group of mostly women were doing out of this house. And as you're looking at the screen, there's Donaldina Cameron. She's looking towards the camera. That's almost certainly a police inspector who's standing on the ladder, and then a policeman with the trafficked woman in his arms. And this photograph I like to share because next to her, and I don't know exactly who it was, I have a few guesses who that might have been, and there may be people in the audience who know exactly who it is, but almost certainly that was a translator, one of many aides who worked at the home, perhaps even one of the ones pictured in the photograph we saw at first. But as that girl comes down the ladder, the first person she'll talk to is the woman who's looking up, who we can't see her face, because she'll be speaking to her in whatever dialect she is speaking in Chinese. Donaldina Cameron did not speak Chinese, and most of the detectives and most of the immigration officers didn't either. There are a few exceptions, of course, but it was those aides who would accompany the girls and women to court, often multiple court hearings and immigration hearings. And they were the warriors, not only in settings where there was some danger involved. For example, finding an abused girl and taking her out of a brothel, not always using what we would consider legal means, but also they did, just years of fighting in courts. And they did this with the help of collaborators. They had volunteer lawyers who helped them. And that was really crucial because so much of this took place in the courts. But I also wanted to mention, Helen, when you mentioned that it was dangerous, when Donaldina Cameron first showed up at the house at 920 Sacramento Street in 1895, she was there supposedly to be a sewing teacher. And right around that time, somebody had placed dynamite around the house. And so there were pretty much continual threats against those women. And that's why there was always a doorkeeper. That's why the windows were barred from the outside to prevent people from getting in. And that's why the girls and women, when they left the home, were always accompanied by somebody, never left alone. So it was dangerous. And I would say one more thing about that, which is that the Chinese staffers at the home, the Asian staffers, often got the most violent threats. And Tian-Fu Wu especially was threatened. And one of the most startling things that I found in the archives at Cameron House itself was a note to Tian, which I won't repeat what it says, but it was vicious, and it was warning her off of what she was doing.
Wow, so these were literally brave women who were subjected to death threats and things against them at all times, and yet they persisted in rescuing, girls and women who had been trafficked and who were in the possession of some of these criminals.
Yeah.
So you went to Cameron House, and I guess we should remind everybody that it's still there, and it's still called Cameron House. And you went there for your research. You actually talked to the family of Donaldina Cameron. Can you share a little bit about what that was like, and kind of retracing their steps, and also gaining the trust and cooperation of the families?
Absolutely. So the first person I met was the former executive director of Cameron House, Doreen Durr-McLeod, a Chinese-American woman who is a very important social worker and activist in her own right in San Francisco, and somebody that I came to admire hugely in the years that I got to know her. And she was the first one to take me into, calling it an archives is probably a bit of an exaggeration, because really it was a closet on the 5th floor of Cameron House, where a bunch of papers were kept. And Doreen had organized them. So she was the person who knew where everything was. And she had the help of the wonderful historian, late historian, Judy Young, who's passed away a few months ago, in organizing some of these case files. But it took quite a while. So at first, Doreen was helped share some of the better known cases that came out of Cameron House. And then as time passed, I think she grew to believe that I would treat these stories with a lot of respect. And so she shared more with me. And I can't say I've seen everything in the case files. I don't think anybody has, except for maybe Doreen and Judy. So other researchers will find some really interesting stories there when the time comes. Now, as for Donaldina Cameron's family, both Donaldina Cameron, who was known as Dolly, and Tien Fu Wu, neither of them ever married and neither of them ever had children. So in other circumstances, I would go straight to the sons and daughters of a subject that I wanted to research, just as you did, Helen, in your wonderful book. In this case, I had to go to grandnieces and nieces and nephews of Donaldina's. And Donaldina's family was very close to Tien. So they had memories of both women because the two of them spent their later years together in Palo Alto. And in fact, they're buried next to each other in Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles. So I heard absolutely wonderful stories about Auntie Wu and how she would make sure to bring chopsticks and Chinese food for someone's birthday. At the same time, I heard stories about Aunt Dolly and what she was like. And she tended to be a bit more stern. She came from a Scottish family, and it was Auntie Wu who was the warmer of the two and, would treat the children a little bit more. So, but it was a great treat. And it's funny because it turned out that one of the nieces of Dolly Cameron is a historian in Colorado who has written about slavery. And she recently wrote a book about slavery, and she dedicated it to Tien Fu Wu, which I think is astonishing because she got interested in the subject because she knew Auntie Wu so well. And she knew Auntie Wu had herself been a slave and had been a trafficked woman.
Well, certainly your book expands the understanding of the extent that slavery took place in America, and was, of course, we know about the slave trade from Africa, but not a lot is known about the slave trade of women and the trafficking of women who were in bondage. And so I wanted to ask you just a little bit about, you got this photograph, and it sort of opens up this idea that that the involvement of these Chinese women, and for many of them, English was their second language and maybe had varying degrees of their proficiency in there. And you started out saying that a lot of their stories were not so available. So this opened up a whole new area of research for you. You mentioned him, Mark Lai, the Chinese-American historian in San Francisco, and that he amazingly had interviewed Tien Fu Wu. But so how was the research, and then trying to find information about the Chinese women who were part of the rescue and Cameron House and all of that. That must have been quite a challenge to get information about them.
It was a challenge. There was another late scholar named Peggy Pascoe out of Stanford who had written a book, I think in the early 80s, maybe. She was the first person to really start digging into the case files at Cameron House. So I had some ideas based on her work, and her partner, she passed away from cancer, and her partner very kindly allowed me to look at some of her papers, which are at the University of Oregon. She was extremely organized and meticulous scholar, so I could retrace some of her steps, for which I'm really grateful. And I have a lot of admiration for what she did. You know, I learned an important lesson as well, and I suspect, Helen, you maybe had the same experience in going to the National Archives and reading immigration interviews from a long time ago. And, you know, there's this issue that historians and journalists struggle with of contaminated, what you might call contaminated material, in that it's not necessarily trustworthy, the official records about what people, I'm not saying anything surprising, but so it was very important to reach out to other scholars who had spent their life studying this issue, paper sons and paper daughters, for example, and learning from them, like what is reliable, what should we take from this material. I chose about 6 of the residents to really focus on. And in those cases, I mean, and there were between 2,000 and 3,000 girls and women who passed through the doors of Cameron House over that 70-year period. So I was able to retell the stories to the degree that I felt good about, and they felt full, three-dimensional for only about 6 of those women. But again, I'm sure that other scholars, other authors will fill out these hidden histories even more as time goes on.
And so to get to Tianfu Wu, you also have another photograph of her, and I see that we have a question in the chat that I want to get to, but if we could just, wow, I have not seen that picture. It must be in your book, so because I know the one you started with that's in the bulletin of the California State Archives is on page 312. This one is a great photo of Tianfu Wu. Yeah. Did you want to talk about that?
Absolutely gorgeous photo. I am so touched by this photograph. So I believe this photograph was shared with me by Doreen at Cameron House. So I think it's in the Cameron House archives. And I have to thank Cameron House, which was extremely generous sharing their material with me. This, I believe, is a photograph of Tien taken when she was about 18 or 19 years old. And she was a precocious young woman. She grew up, she was sold around 8 years old and came across in a steamer from China to San Francisco, and initially worked in a brothel, not as a sex worker, but as a child slave. And she was very badly abused. She was sold to someone else, and her condition came to the attention of authorities. And so a policeman brought her to 920 Sacramento Street. And she left behind the most touching memories of what it was like to grow up in that house which really hasn't changed very much since she was there. Well, of course, it was rebuilt after the earthquake, but still, since then. And she was one of the few women who had the extraordinary good luck and also the capability to pursue an advanced education. So she, through the house, found a patron who helped pay for her to go to a very elite boarding school in Philadelphia, the same one that Grace Kelly went to, of all people. And then she went to college. And when she got out of college, she wanted to go back to China to try to find her mother and her grandmother. And there had been so much turmoil, so much war. She could not find her family. And she realized that the only family she really had was in the house. And so she came back and she went to work for Donaldina Cameron. Initially, she was the household manager, but very quickly she proved her smarts and her capability. And she ran the house when Donaldina Cameron was out traveling around the country. And she accompanied trafficked women back to China in some instances. And she had an extraordinary life. She traveled across the country to Boston and Philadelphia and other places to check up on girls and women who'd been married to make sure that their lives were good lives and that they weren't being mistreated. But I love that photograph in particular because it shows her in her traveling coat, and it's a little too big for her. And I'm glad you hadn't seen that before. It's fun to show it to you.
She sounds like she could have a book all about herself. I mean, with what she had been through in her life, my goodness.
Well, and Helen, and the reason that I think she's so important and the photograph is so important is she's an example of an Asian woman during that time who was actively fighting against the social injustice that she had experienced herself. And so, yes, I noticed, for example, that the Women's History Museum in Sacramento had a recent exhibit for Women's History Month, and I think they featured Tien Fu Wu. So I do believe her story is becoming better known, and I'm hoping, I mean, maybe even a children's book would be wonderful about her life and how, you know, how she took what she was given and made something out of it.
Well, and that's a really good actual segue to the question that came out in the chat, which is about how periods of time that you're writing about in the past, or my book, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, when I was writing that and writing the conclusion, all of the anti-immigrant stuff was going on at our southern border and kids were being taken away from their parents. And it just made a connection for me. And I'm wondering about that for you. I mean, here we are tonight, you know, 2 days after a mass killing of especially seem to be targeting Asian women who work in the spa business, but there are many, many Asian women who work in the beauty industry, I guess you'd call it, whether those are nail salons, beauty supplies, spas like the ones that were targeted. And your book is about the, you know, trying to fight sex trafficking and the sex slavery in Chinatowns. So the root, I mean, of this image and this discussion that's going on, whether the sexualization of Asian women has anything to do with race at all, as though they could be, their identities could be separated. And so I just want to read the question that came in from a wonderful author, Constance Hale, and she's asking, I wonder if you have thoughts about the relevance of this story today, literally, and what does this story tell us about the moments in US history of the greatest anti-Chinese racism, or has it been a continuum rather than moments? And so from your perspective in your book and writing about you know, this fight against the abuse of women, really, the sex trafficking of Chinese women, but you could also extend that to what happens with so many women, and connect that to today.
Well, I would say at periods of economic vulnerability or political vulnerability, the 1870s, I would say the 1980s, when Helen, you led the campaign for justice for Vincent Chin, who was killed by Detroit auto workers. That's a perfect example of this. So in periods of economic turmoil, I think that particularly Asians have been targeted again and again. And, you know, I'm waiting for the next day story, just like you, Helen, of what of the women's lives who were killed in that horrifying massacre. And, you know, I would like to see them not depersonalized. We don't know their names. We don't know their families. We don't know their stories. We know who the killer was. But I really want to turn this over to you, because you've been thinking hard about this subject for a long time as an activist. Helen just wrote a really powerful op-ed for the Washington Post on this subject. So I'd really like to hear what you think about it.
Well, as you say, I mean, there's a continuum, and, you know, waiting to hear about the lives of the women who were so tragically murdered by this mass killer. And there's actually a debate going on among the people, the community, Asian American activists on the ground now in Atlanta. Do we publish their names? You know, it's a matter of public record. The reporters are already saying their names. You're a journalist, and so am I. And we know that people want to humanize them. At the same time, and this might have been true for the period, you know, I'm sure it was true for the period, you know, of your book, that there is so much stigma attached to the idea that you might have been working in these, you know, whether you were there against your will, you know, enslaved to work in a brothel, or working in a spa, which may or may not have had anything to do with the sex trade. And a lot of massage parlors do not. So that should not be an assumption in the case of the 4 spas that were blown up in Atlanta. But there is this debate whether to use their names, and how do we humanize them without using their names, which makes it even more remarkable that you were able to not only get the names of these women in your book, and the ones who had been rescued or somehow escaped from those lives that they were forced into. And then you were able to construct things about their lives. I mean, here we are, you know, in 2021, and people aren't sure of what the stories are behind the women in Atlanta, and whether their families, you know, will allow those stories to be told. So it is, it's a big challenge. But to the point of whether there's a continuum, or are these just episodic periods of hate that rise up, I have to say I'm of the opinion that the hate never really went away. It's part of, well, it's really a part of how Chinese Americans and Asian Americans fit into American culture. And it often becomes invisible. People forget about it. Asian Americans don't forget about it because we experience it on a daily basis. But certainly this past year, or I would say 15 months, ever since the coronavirus was identified, Asian Americans have been experiencing, you know, the harassment, the hate, the assaults. And in recent weeks, even before this terrible thing in Atlanta, you know, some of the questions were, are you, oh, Asian Americans, are you, you know, you experience racism, really? Or now you know what racism is like. And it's kind of like, no, we could go back to Tian Fu Wu and ask her. And it's been there. It's been there. And in the op-ed piece that you mentioned, I actually wrote a year ago saying that I think it's going to get worse. And some of us privately talked about how bad could it get. And we actually talked about it could be lead to mass killings, and we shouldn't be shocked. But of course, nobody wants to talk about that. And here we are at that nightmare. So I think there are lessons to be taken from, you know, the past, so that we don't, you know, so we can stop repeating it. And certainly with your book and your work, it identifies a time when women actually, you know, women who didn't carry guns, actually managed to not only resist, but subvert a whole system that was not only, anti-Chinese, but also anti-women, and really make a difference. And I just think that's such a lesson that has to be taught over and over again.
Yeah.
What would you say about the influence that that came out of the women that you wrote about in White Devil's Daughter?
Well, I guess the most notable is that right around the turn of the century, there were hearings in which Donaldina, as well as a number of the residents of the home, testified in front of state legislators about their experience of being trafficked and what that was like. Of course, during that time, they didn't use the word traffic. They used the word the slave girl trade, which is something we wouldn't really use now, but they were talking about trafficking. And as a result of those hearings, the first piece of anti-trafficking legislation in the state of California was passed. So they, I think even more importantly, they raised the issue of trafficking. And, it made for good copy in ways that make us kind of wince a little bit now when we go back and look at the newspaper coverage and look back at the feature stories, because they very much focused on, one woman, Donaldina Cameron, taking these steps to try to help a vulnerable group of women. And we know that it actually was a big team of people working to make that happen. But I find it an inspiring story because, as you point out, Helen, it was a really small group of people who ran this, and they ran it on a shoestring. They were always short of money. Always, always, always. Yet they really, really changed the way people thought about the buying and selling of humans. And tomorrow I'm speaking at a UN commission on the status of women. And there's a San Francisco delegation of women, including Judge Susan Briel, and I'm on a panel with her. And I'm going to be telling the story of these pioneers, these anti-trafficking pioneers. And granted, it was a small project, but it was an important project. And, it's interesting. It sometimes can seem overwhelming. And I certainly found the women talk about periods where they were discouraged, where they didn't have enough money, where they wanted to give up, when they didn't think they could keep going. They were spat at, they were threatened, but they kept going for a very long time. And as a result, they arguably changed thousands of people's lives by doing that. So I guess, if anything, I'm hoping this book, gives people hope that even a small group of people can bring about change in this world.
And that's exciting that you're going to be presenting, to the UN tomorrow to be talking about this. And so do you think that's there's a question from Jocelyn Combs asking, what is the legacy now, if any, in Chinatown of the early enslavement and trafficking of Chinese women? And maybe that's really what is the legacy or lessons today for, women who are fighting the abuse and the violence and trafficking of women today, whether it's in Chinatown or not. I imagine that might be something that's going to be coming, the topic of the program tomorrow at the UN.
Absolutely. Then there is a legacy of social service and of fighting trafficking. And that's why the San Francisco delegation is going to be talking about trafficking, because our city has been a leader in coming up with some innovative collaborative partnerships, city-private partnerships to tackle this social issue.
Mm-hmm. I'm just mindful of the time, and I know that you have something more to say about that photo that landed on your lap.
Well, of course.
And
Of
also,
course.
I just, I went back and reread, parts of your wonderful book, and just was so engaged again by Tianfu Wu, and that she was called the Little General, and that was her
Yeah.
nickname. And I can really see it in that photograph that she really does look like, "Yeah, I'm in control here."
Yeah, she is my favorite character of the book. I thought she was absolutely marvelous. And the other residents, everybody who lived in the home had chores to do. And initially she kind of ran the house and did that for a very long time as well. And she had a list of what everybody was supposed to be doing. And the other residents called it her Book of Lamentations because she was tough. It's like, okay, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. So I absolutely love that. And there's so many things that are interesting about this photograph to me. We still don't know who all those women are. I've got a couple of guesses about who they are, but I don't know entirely. I wish Louis J. Stellman had bothered to identify them. And maybe someday we'll find, maybe somebody will say, hey, that was my grandmother. That would be pretty amazing if something like that happened. And I have had people, since the book came out, come up to me and say, you wrote about my mother, you wrote about my grandmother, or that was my auntie. So that's been really, really a wonderful thing.
Julia, as I look at this picture and I think of then and I think of today and what you discovered about Tianfu Wu and just how much influence and day-to-day administration and things like that she had. Back then, she had to be the assistant to Donaldina Cameron. Yes. She could not have, well, I guess I want to ask you, would there have been a circumstance where if Donaldina Cameron had been unable to continue or wanted to step back, could this operation have continued, the mission house under the leadership of Tianfu Wu or one of these other Chinese women?
That's a great question. So Dolly Cameron had put forward Tianfu Wu to succeed her when the time came for her to retire in the mid-1930s. And the correspondence is really heart-wrenching. And Tien wrote to the folks in New York who made the hiring decision to very humbly say, look, I don't think I can do this job. And I can understand why she made that decision, in that Donaldina Cameron spent a lot of her time in the parlors of Nob Hill and down in, the wealthier sections of Los Angeles, essentially begging for money. And these were in white households begging for money. And whether Tien would have, during that period of time, been given the entree to ask for funds, I just don't know. In fact, what happened was that for a period of time, the function of what was then Cameron House as a safe house ended, and it was turned into a language school, and then a community center run by a white pastor for many years. So now I would say Doreen, who is Chinese American, she ran Cameron House, and she did, as far as I understand, an absolutely unbelievable job, a wonderful job. And the world is different in that respect. In the 1930s, there still was tremendous amount of prejudice against the Chinese. So whether she could have been the fundraiser she needed to be, I just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a change today from back then. a lot of the groups on the ground that are working around the, what happened in Atlanta, and also fighting against trafficking of women and violence against women today are really, a wide range of multiracial
Yes.
women working together.
Yep.
And Cameron House and the White Devil's Daughters, as portrayed, in your book, I guess was a really early example of what women from very different backgrounds could do together.
Yes, yes. It was
And so-
multicultural. Well,
So we're almost at the end of our time, and I don't know if you want to say a few words about what it is like for maybe some of the audience who are doing research or are thinking of doing research on topics and people at the California State Library or the archives. What was that like for you, and anything you want to say about that?
well, a huge shout out and thank you to the California State Library, and especially the way in which on her own initiative, she reached out to me with this new discovery. I mean, that was a great act of generosity, and I very much appreciated that. And I'm grateful that we have such an amazing resource. And one more time, I just want to say that if you have a chance, people who are here, this is a wonderful book. So that's how I'd like to end it, because Helen has taken
thank
time,
you, Julia.
out of her very, very busy schedule and to do this. And so I really appreciate it, Helen. Thank you. And Brittany Dawn, thank you for having us. It's really kind of you.
Thank you both for joining us. I'm trying to find myself so I can spotlight myself for everybody else. Thank you both so much for this amazing evening. Honestly, I'm just blown away and so appreciative that you both could make this event for us. And just hands down, I adore both of you. So thank you again. And I hope everybody else had just as much of a great evening as I did, because I'm still speechless. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
and
everybody.
It was really always a delight to see Julia. Thank you, and your wonderful book and your work.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that ends the evening for us. This has been recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel as soon as possible. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email them to us through our website. And again, thank you all for joining, and have a wonderful evening.